Hello, this is Gail Ferris. I'm taking you on a journey to see the traditional Aleut kayak in Kodiak, Alaska. I'm here in the Aluteq Museum, and we are looking at a reproduction kayak that Joe Kelly supervised its construction of. What I'm focused on is the bow. The grain follows the shape of the bow as close as possible for strength. It's difficult to find just the right piece of wood. This is the most difficult piece in the boat, correct?
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah. Guess you have to do a lot of guessing.
Your deck beams also are from similar pieces of wood that follow.
These deck beams are, in this boat, made of what?
All of this boat is made out of spruce.
Okay.
Originally, the ribs would have most likely been made of alder. And we chose, because of the expediency, to use spruce, but alder would have probably been the wood of choice in the original boats, because it would have been selected and bent, shaped and bent green.
Now, this bow piece that we were just looking at is, you said before, it's pegged in?
That is sort of like a truss system. You have your keelson, which utilizes a scarf joint, is latched in.
Yep.
Your two gunnels come in and are lashed into this socket.
Yep.
You have your two bottom stringers that are located into a notch and give it flexibility from side to side. They catch it. And then you have your bow plates, which run, that are located into a notch and give it flexibility from side to side. They catch it. And then you have your bow plates, which run gunnels to your bow piece. They're pegged and also lashed. We used rawhide, but most likely that would have been sinew or spruce root. Spruce root was used many times.
I noticed that the stringers are carefully fared in so that there's no bumps in the surface of the boat where they feed into the bow.
Right, although this section would probably, unless they really were sticking out grossly, the skin would be...
Yes, that's right.
The bottom, the lower stringer is, of course, important. The other two could be a little less careful, maybe. But although I don't think they were put in there sloppily anyway.
The other thing, there are surfaces on this to accommodate the fact that the skin must be able to dry easily, so that that's the reason for these grooves, is so that air can pass over this when the boat is out of the water, so that the skin covering will dry.
It's likely
correct.
Yeah.
Because that's critical, otherwise it rots out in a hurry. To tighten these ties, you go around several times, and each time you pull up as hard as you can, and then finally you would knot it off?
Well, like this major lashing that lashes the bow piece.
The
gunnels. The string or line would go in here. Down around under the keelson, back up through the other gunnel, back through, and which would form a V from here down to here.
Okay.
Of course, that's put on before your stringers.
Yes.
So you've got basically a V, and you begin wrapping. And as you wrap, you tighten this together. You get rid of the V, which essentially is like a clamp. It tightens in. Pulls the V in and takes up any slack that you might have had left in there. That was a real common thing to see done on kayaks, and it's a common thing to see done on things that might be lashed in the in that era.
Yes. Now, along the top of the gunnels, there is a plate. It looks like a plate, this piece. Now this, I gather, would be to add volume to the bow in big waves.
Well, that's one thing that it would do. The other thing is it ties the gunnels, the keelson, and the deck stringer all together. These two plates
Yes.
are part of that truss system I was talking about earlier that really add rigidity to the bow.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Now the deck stringer, I find this fascinating, that it goes and it follows the curve of the bow exactly, all the way to the very tip. This I've never seen before. And I think part of the reason is, first of all, to let some air in, and second of all, to give structural integrity to the bow.
Yeah. And the Aluteq name for this piece, I can't remember it now, but it essentially, literally meant the thing that you pick it up by or the thing that you hold it by.
Aha.
They had just been made for a simple function of carrying the boat.
Yes, especially at the last minute, let's say grabbing it out of the water, in and out. I would assume that would be very handy for that. These ribs are mortised into the gunnels.
Yes.
So they,
About 30 ribs on this kayak.
but it's designed so that the deck flexes a little differently than the bottom,
Yeah,
which would give it, it would affect its character in the seas.
When you build the boat upside down, you basically put the gunnels, the deck beams, the bow, the stern together as a unit. Flip it upside down, and then you start adding the ribs. Once the ribs are in, you add the stringers, and then you begin to lash it all together.
I think one thing that's important about this boat is it is built to take many different types of sea conditions and absorb them each in the same way. So you can have a small sea where this bow will, with a lower section which is meant for little waves, and then you have the increased buoyancy of the upper section of this bow, which is wider. The small seas act on the bottom of the hull, which is the most flexible part, and then when you get into larger seas, the gunnels start absorbing the wave stress, so that each part of the boat flexes with the kind of sea that it's in. And what I mean is, the larger the waves, the different parts of the boat flex differently so that you're getting a boat that integrates with the water.
Well, no one can look at these boats and help but realize how technologically capable the people were who put them together and survived in a situation that people have a hard time surviving in with all kind of technology.
Okay.
The skin's not laying flat against it. It also may add strength. Just
Yes.
like putting ridges in your corrugated metal, etc. It adds strength to it. Could be a function of adding strength. This, of course, is sort of for your skirt to tie around, this lip.
Is that a scarf underneath?
It
Midship.
should- Yeah, it's not a locking scarf, although I've
Mhm.
seen them use different kinds of scarf joints.
Yeah. This is a slightly oval-shaped cockpit.
Some of them, many of them are. I've seen boats. The larger boats tend to have round hatches because when you're kneeling, you don't need as large a hatch. And so this may not be totally correct. That's one detail that has been hard to verify. The larger boats that we've seen, though, do tend, but there's almost no documentation on the single. We're a little unclear about the exact hatches. With the oval hatch, you still have more volume, but you don't take so much of the width of the boat away. But if that were a larger boat, I would say that it probably would be round.
Okay.
Or the doubles or three hatch. The single hatch boat was called Kayak, which
Mhm.
meant alone. Kayak Puck was the double, and Patalik was the three hatch boat. So they all three had different names. All three were kayaks,
But
had
different,
specific names.
the ribs, I was just noticing, are not just lashed in one direction, but to equalize the pressure, they lashed them in the opposite way also. You can see they cross over one way and then they crisscross the opposite way, which would make sense to sort of keep things from moving. I think the most simple part of the boat is actually the stringer on the deck. The stern is rather interesting. This is curious because the keelson extends completely back.
And I've seen different ways of doing this. I've seen this piece be one. See that this piece, the stern piece, actually is part of the keelson. There'll be maybe 3 or 4 feet out there. Will be a scarf joint.
Okay.
And then maybe there are some models that I've seen where the bow piece actually had a piece of the keelson as an integral part, and maybe came 3 feet or so past it. And there was just 2 pieces, one from the back bow, and one from the bow, one from the stern, and then there was just a short. So anyway, I've seen both, especially in models. There's some archaeological models that we dug in Carla that show the bow piece with a long elongated piece on it, like that. That's over in the Baranoff, and then I've seen it where this is several times. I think I've actually seen a full size to where the keelson is part of the stern piece. Now this is actually a mortise and tenon. This is a tenon that goes back in here, and there's a tenon on this deck stringer.
That has to be quite tricky.
So, and then it's lashed in with sinew or spruce root into this.
Okay.
And like most of it, we peg this with 3 different pegs. Usually pegged wherever the sinew went through, they would peg it just, I guess, to make sure it didn't unravel.
Backslide, yeah. Yeah, just to really double lock it in. Yeah.
So the whole thing was pretty well thought out, very well thought out.
I'm looking at these deck beams, and I think it's interesting to me I notice that they're wide one way and then wide another way. They're very carefully chosen. The shape is wide where the stress is going to be.
Where they trade off width in the horizontal plane,
Yeah.
they gain depth in the vertical plane. So you end up with about the same mass. And right here, it's probably more functional to have more depth in the vertical plane.
Yep.
Under this.
Yep, because the stretch is going to be that way.
Then it phases into a narrow in the vertical plane and wide in the horizontal to make the transition for the tenon that goes into the gun. It's an interesting thing. I remember one of the owners telling me in the double, if you're paddling in the stern, you're having a hard go of it into the wind.
Yeah.
Keep it in, as you can imagine, if you've got quite a few feet of kayak in front of you, trying to keep that straight into a quartering wind can be real difficult.
Yes, yes.
So they would do a maneuver where they turned around in the hatch.
You're kidding.
It's called Kayak,
Yeah?
something like that, and they went in for in, so they would turn around and paddle the stern into the wind. And then you only had 4 or 5 feet to control instead of 15 feet out in front of you to manage. So you can imagine the leverage was, you had a lot more control of where your boat went.
That would also explain why your deck height from bow to stern is the same. But yes, this could be, you could reverse paddle this.
Well, another way to look at it, you've got 2 options in building the boat. You can have a deck with a lot of shear in it.
Yep, yep.
Or you can have a bottom with a lot of rocker in it. It's hard to get both. You know, trade off one. If you build rocker into your boats, you're gonna end up with a pretty flat deck. If you build a pretty flat keel, then you're gonna have a lot of rocker, or a lot of shear in your boat, end to end, to match that, so it's hard to get both. You notice there was a lot of shear in the deck and a real flat keel, so we looked at the pictures, or I did, and I said, this isn't right. No other kayak looks like this. So, went from that generation to something that looked quite a bit like this.
I have found that a boat with rocker is much more kindly in steep waves.
So this is just to show the amount of rocker this boat has. And the nice thing also is the curve of the bilges here is a very soft, subtle, elliptical shape.
Yeah, that also is very tender.
Yeah. Yeah, but in big seas it would stiffen up. But in really flat, calm water it would be tricky.
It's a high volume boat.
That keelson looks like it's almost 1.5 inches depth.
Yeah, an inch and a quarter to
Your stringers look like they're about 3/4 of an inch.
3/4 to 5 inches. And the real ones were probably about a half inch.
Yeah.
Realistic. Half inch to 5/8. Those are a little bit beefier than they originally were.
How about your gunnels, that thickness of gunnel? Do you think that was the more typical dimension?
Well, from the smaller kayaks, yeah, because I've seen some from archaeological sites who are about that same size.
So the dimension of that gunnel looks like it's about
It's about an
inch.
and a quarter
Yeah,
by 7/8.
7/8. Yeah, so much different than any Greenland boat. They're entirely
Oh, yeah.
gunnel-dependent structures. Whereas this
It's
is,
got all those ribs and
yeah,
stringers that act as part of the structure. You don't need such a massive gunnel like the Greenland.
yes, yes. How are those deck ribs? They're mortised through the gunnel, and oh, I see. They're tied. They're tied off.
Yeah, and you've got about 3 different angles to consider ours for a skilled builder in putting this little boat together, the frame.
Yeah, to figure out the shape and the angles on those mortises, each one is, yeah, that's not easy.
I've done it by hand, and I've done it after I did a few. Then I wrote down the dimensions and the angles for each one, and began to use a drill press and mortising tool.
Yeah,
And then I could calculate all my angles at once. There's about a 9-degree slant here, so many degrees slant here, and then an angle that it comes through the other way. So there's 3 different angles to consider anytime you drill.
yeah, and each one is different. Oh, boy.
And they change, yeah, right.
Yep, as you go down the boat. Yeah. So it required this, really, the skills of someone who was very good at carving.
Yes. And had a good eye, because all the ribs, that's strictly visual.
Yes, yeah.
And those are all put in there. Those are put in there with just visual reference for symmetry.
Yes. Then they're also spaced for where they feel there's most likely to be a lot of deck stress. Now you see closer to the cockpit, you have the ribs are closer. And then aft, where there's going to be less weight and stress on the deck, there's a larger space. It's a beautiful boat.
Yeah,
I want to thank you very much for
that frame
this.
was built by Bud Roselle from Kayak. He did most of our construction while we were
Boy,
doing the project.
it's
Beautiful
amazing.
work.
Well, thank you very much. This is at the Aluteq Museum in Kodiak, Alaska. This is the skin covered version of this same boat we've just been discussing. Just out of curiosity, note that the bow has a hollow in it, and so does the stern that shears off the bow wake and stern wake. Also, the harpooner is just balancing the kayak with his body. He doesn't need to balance with his paddle. In this picture, a gentleman is demonstrating how this boat handles in a fairly windy situation, actually. And in a moment, he's going to swing around, and you can see how much of the bow actually is in the water when there's only a person sitting in it. Very interesting boat. This is an old Bidarka frame that has some restoration on it, just to show you the details and the delicacy of the structure. Note the dimensions and number of ribs and stringers. It's fascinating to think such a long boat could have such small members in it. It must have been very interesting to paddle, and note how round the bottom is. Thank you. This is Gail Ferris, your narrator and videographer.